technological situation. But I'm pleased nonetheless to welcome you on behalf of the Institute for Advanced Study to this lecture by a visiting fellow, John Barrell, who is now in his second week in Bloomington, interacting with faculty and students, advancing the study of 18th century literature and culture. It's well to remember that such visits by distinguished scholars and researchers have been going on for 20 years, and this year celebrates the 20th anniversary of the Institute, one of those anomalous units that reaches out to all 8 campuses of the IU system. From the beginning, we have sought to facilitate, encourage, and produce knowledge, and lectures such as this afternoon's provide rich occasions for the exchange of research and, no doubt, the modeling of how to do it. I'm pleased to turn things now to my colleague, Ken Johnston, who has made this lecture possible and who will introduce our speaker.
Thanks, Mary Ellen. It's my pleasure to welcome, thanks for all coming out this afternoon, to welcome John Barrell here to his first lecture with the Institute for Advanced Study. John got his PhD from the University of Essex, and his teaching career has been variously at the University of Essex, Sussex, Cambridge, a couple of colleges at Cambridge, and since 1993 at York University in England, where he has been the director of its renowned, thanks to him now, Center for 18th Century Studies. And he is currently head of the Department of English and Related Languages, which until lunch I thought meant English and German and Old Norse, but it means English, Complet, and every other language that they're teaching at York, and French, Spanish. So he's basically the head of the Literature and Languages Department, I guess we would call it. And he's currently, as I say, the head of that department, from which post he'll be stepping down this year, thankfully, an emotion that I can appreciate. His writing and teaching cover a wide range of disciplines: politics, literature, art history, medicine. But as he says, he doesn't set himself up self-consciously to be an interdisciplinarian or ask permission to cross disciplinary boundaries. He just does it. And this is one of the things I admire most about John Barrell's work. It has an edge, sometimes polemical, sometimes not quite that much of an edge. But it has an edge, and he has a consistent ability and talent to keep asking pertinent and sometimes impertinent questions of the fields and the texts that he's working on. With this background and this motivation, he's published a number of books, well over a dozen by my count, including a book on English landscape painting and the sense of place. Another one, a classic of its kind, the title of which is The Dark Side of the Landscape, the Rural Poor in English Painting, 1730 to 1840. And the title there tells a lot. It doesn't tell all, but basically the rural poor are in the dark side of the landscape, and things are not so picturesque there. Another book he published in 1986 with Yale University Press is The Political Theory of Painting, from Reynolds to Hazlitt, with the suggestive subtitle of The Body Politic. Also from Yale in 1991, he published The Infection of Thomas de Quincey, placing the addiction of that famous English opium eater in the context of British imperialism. And most recently, he has published Imagining the King's Death, Figurative Treason and Fantasies of Regicide, 1793 to 1796, published by Oxford University Press in the year 2000. This is a study of the legal rhetoric and indeed the legal fictions that the government lawyers or law lords in Britain used to suppress the Republican reform movement in Britain of the 1790s, effectively ending England's opportunity to become a modern democratic republic. I have to say, it is a democracy still today, but it's a constitutional monarchy, not a republic. John is a member of the British Academy. He's recently been awarded a Lieberhume grant, which is, by my way of estimating, is like sort of between a Guggenheim and a MacArthur. He'll have 2 years off researching his current project, which is a book on propaganda in this period, toward which today's lecture is, I imagine, a work in progress. So please join me in welcoming John Barrell for his exhibition, Extraordinary Mock-Advertisements as Radical Propaganda in 1790s Britain. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Mary, and thanks, Ken. I'll stand here for when the lights go out. I think you must probably expect a good deal of provisionality with the audio visuals while we work out how best to handle them. This paper is about some very unusual and now very rare political satires, mostly dating from 1795, which I came across 10 years ago, scattered around from San Francisco to Stockholm, though most of them are in the British Library. I've already published some stuff about them in some pretty obscure locations, so this isn't exactly new work that I'm offering you. It's my latest take on a series of puzzling texts, which, however, or so I hope, will be new to you, and I hope you find them as fascinating and as delightful as I do. I'll be concentrating on trying to give you an idea of their general character and the context in which they appear, rather than pausing to analyze individual satires. But if you want to return to any at the end of the lecture, you've got a list of the slides, so you can sort of mark which ones you'd like to talk about more, and we could look at them in a bit more detail. Okay, a new, witty, and immensely inventive kind of political propaganda appeared in London in the mid-1790s. Mock-Advertisements, which represented the activities of George III, the government of William Pitt, and the British Army under the leadership of its incompetent commander-in-chief, the Duke of York, as a series of spectacles and entertainments, as ceremonial processions, exhibitions of paintings, auction sales, and so on, but primarily as plays, pantomimes, and magic shows. The first of these satires seems to have appeared in the summer of 1793, but they came to be seen as a problem by government early in 1794, were immediately suppressed, and then emerged again in November 1794. Thereafter, they became one of the most popular forms of radical satire on the king and government, until by the summer of 1795 their vogue had passed and very few new examples appeared. The old favorites continued to be sold, however, until they were again suppressed at the end of 1795 by the exemplary arrest of one of the booksellers who published and sold them, and by the passing of the Treasonable Practices Bill, which made a second offense of publishing a seditious libel punishable by transportation to Botany Bay. Now, these satires raise all kinds of fascinating questions about how they were disseminated, their authorship, their supposed audience, the effect they were intended to have, the propaganda resources available to the popular radical movement in the 1790s, the relations between polite politicians and popular radicalism, and so on. They also raise a very specific question about the policy of the government, which, having suppressed the first examples, allowed them to proliferate unchecked for most of 1795. To understand the context in which these strange texts appear, we need to start 3 years after the fall of Bastille. The Bastille had signaled the start of the French Revolution. We need to start in 1792, when the political climate of Britain was undergoing a decisive change. In the summer of that year, the government of William Pitt issued a proclamation against the proliferation of seditious writings. There was particular concern about the two parts of Rights of Man by Tom Paine and their circulation by and among the new popular societies in London, Sheffield, Manchester, Norwich, and elsewhere, dedicated to the reform of Parliament by the introduction of universal manhood suffrage. Meanwhile, Austria and Prussia were at war with France, demanding that Louis XVI be restored to the powers he'd enjoyed before 1789. And it seemed more and more likely that Pitt's government would join the coalition, especially following the declaration in September of the French Republic and the imprisonment of the French royal family. By the end of the year, 1792, a network of loyal associations had been set up across the country in order to police at a local level the political views of the people, to threaten and, if necessary, to punish those who expressed pro-French, pro-reform, anti-monarchical sentiments. In the following year, 1793, the temperature rose still higher. In January, Louis XVI was tried and guillotined, and in February, Britain and France were at war. Throughout the country, mainly by the efforts of those associationists I mentioned, there were prosecutions of radicals for seditious libel or seditious words, the expression in print or in speech of improper political opinions. The first efforts of the Reform Societies culminated in a nationwide petitioning campaign and a parliamentary motion in favour of reform, proposed in the House of Commons by Charles Grey, who some 40 years later, as Earl Grey of tea fame, would carry the 1832 Reform Bill. When his motion was rejected, it became clear to the Reform Societies that the war, for as long as it lasted, would provide the government with a reason to reject as untimely any demand for any degree of reform. They began, therefore, to adopt new tactics. They abandoned what the government regarded as the only constitutional way of furthering their objective, the petitioning of King and Parliament, and began planning a series of conventions, first of the Reform Societies, and eventually of delegates who would supposedly represent the nation as a whole, and whose demand for universal suffrage they believed would be so loud, unanimous, and convincing that the government would be unable to resist it. The first convention of the Scottish and English societies was held in Edinburgh late in 1793. It styled itself the British Convention, as if it were the equivalent of the National Convention in France, and it adopted the forms and conventions of the French Convention in preference to those of the British Parliament. Alarmed, the authorities in Edinburgh dispersed the convention by force, and early in 1794, the most influential of the delegates from Edinburgh and from the London Corresponding Society was sentenced to 14 years' transportation to Botany Bay. Only one survived the sentence. In London, the LCS and the more polite Society for Constitutional Information, the LCS, London Corresponding Society, Society for Constitutional Information, I may find myself referring to as the SCI, the SCI had also sent a delegate to Scotland, but these two London societies, the LCS and the SCI, began planning to reconvene the British Convention somewhere in England. It was in this context that, in February, a letter was delivered to the office of the Attorney General from York. It complained that a seditious handbill was circulating there in the form of a mock playbill, a mock advertisement for a comical tragedy entitled Long Faces, in which George III was satirized as the mad King Nebuchadnezzar, and the army of the French Republic was represented as doing God's work in driving the Allied invaders back beyond its borders. Doing God's work, of course, because the French Revolution was interpreted by English dissenters, especially as a war on the Antichrist in Rome. And so any war between the French Republic and the Holy Roman Empire, which was what was at stake, was quite clearly God's intent. The supposed publisher of the satire, a leading Yorkshire reformer, was swiftly prosecuted and imprisoned. But at the end of February, the handbill had been discovered too in London by a government spy. And it, in fact, it's fairly clear it originated in London. The spy heard it read to great applause at a meeting of the LCS. It turned up also in Leicestershire and Derbyshire, and those who were deemed to have circulated or published it there were tried and imprisoned. In early May, the government had decided to act against the reform societies in England and began rounding up their leaders, including Thomas Hardy and John Thelwall of the LCS and the linguist John Horne Tooke of the SCI, all of whom would be tried for high treason and acquitted before the end of the year. The first to be arrested was Hardy, the secretary of the LCS, a shoemaker, lived in Piccadilly. When his house was searched, a second mock playbill was discovered, apparently much more dangerous than the first. Now, this is what I thought might be the snag. I really hope that can be focused up better because the bottom is clearly illegible, though the top's just about legible. I can't do anything with this. I'm afraid it's. Voila. Maybe while you're there, Ken, you could try and do something to that, because as you can see, you seem to have the magic touch. The top is legible, but the bottom is much. There, great. It was better. There, a bit back, yeah. It doesn't do fine. Okay. Now, how can I stand? I think I better go back. Yeah. This second playbill advertised La Guillotine or George's Head in the Basket, a new and entertaining farce in which all the male members of the royal family and their political supporters would be decapitated and all the leading bishops of the Church of England hanged in a revolution staged managed by Charles James Fox and other leading members of the Whig opposition in Parliament. You can basically see the structure. Numpy III, Mr. Guelph and his various sons, Grand Inquisitor Mr. Pensioner Reeves, the leader of the Crown and Anchor Society, the Loyalist Association, Mr. Edmund Calumny is Don Quixote, Knight of the Dagger is, of course, Edmund Burke. Carefully encoded are the names of the opposition politicians, Citizens Fox, Sheridan, Grey, and Erskine, who perform the function of municipal guards. Here's one of these, I love finding these F for S's jokes. I mean, the F for S was a joke in the 18th century, it's not just now. So you often find this joke, the Empress of Ruffians, which depends on it having been transcribed from lowercase as Russians. And there's the Duke of Brunswick, tightrope dancing from the lamppost by the bishops, the leading bishops of the Church of England. In the course of the evening will be sung in full chorus Saïra and Bob Shave, Great George, our King. Shave, of course, meaning decapitate. The whole to conclude with a grand decapitation of placeman pensioners and German leeches. Admittance threepence each person, when half a crown would have been a usual fee for this kind of entertainment. Well, not this kind of entertainment, but the kind of entertainment it's pretending to be. Vive la liberté, vive la République. Now, this is a difficult text to pin down. It's not certain when it first appeared, and it may not be quite the radical satire that historians have always assumed it to be. According to the Morning Chronicle, a handbill in the form of a mock playbill and replete with the most scandalous abuse of the king and royal family had been distributed on the streets of London on July the 31st, 1793. And the following weekend had been posted up on a Saturday night in various places in the city to meet the eye of the crowds that Sunday draws abroad. This sounds very like La Guillotine, which, though it was found in 1794 in a broadside version, we know had been first published sometime in the previous year in a smaller handbill-sized format. It's unlikely, however, that the handbill version had been distributed quite as widely as the Chronicle suggests. I've not found that story in other newspapers, and no copy of the bill has been preserved, even in the Public Record Office. I've mocked this up because in the trial of Hardy, the whole thing was reprinted, and I'm sort of pasted up 2 pages and made it look like a handbill. The fact that it had been distributed without any interference from the magistrates was enough to convince the Liberal Chronicle, or so it claimed, that it was a piece of loyalist black propaganda designed to be attributed to radical sympathizers in order to discredit the reform movement, and more to the point, in order to represent the opposition in Parliament as full-blooded revolutionaries. Now, whether or not this is true is anybody's guess. There were examples of other forms of black propaganda circulated by the government and their supporters, which we know about. According to one government spy, there were members of the LCS who believed La Guillotine had been written by a radical so extreme that he was rumored to be a French spy. That's to say, the radicals accepted this as genuine radical propaganda, though they weren't sure who had produced it. And I'm not sure the government knew who had produced it. I mean, if it was a piece of black propaganda, I don't think the government knew it was. On the other hand, at the trial of Hardy in the autumn of 1794, when the prosecution produced the advertisement as evidence of Hardy's treasonable disposition, his counsel, the great liberal advocate Thomas Erskine, who's up there, announced that he would prove that La Guillotine had been forged by agents of the government. As you see, Erskine himself was represented in the satire as one of Fox's gang of Republicans and would-be regicides, and so he had a strong personal interest in making this claim, though he probably couldn't prove it, and when his turn came, he didn't even try. That doesn't mean he was wrong, however. The charge that the Foxite Whigs were closet Republicans was made repeatedly in Loyalist publications in the mid-1790s in an effort to discredit their opposition, in particular to the war with France. And there was no obvious advantage to reformers and radicals in making the same charge. But if the provenance of La Guillotine remains a mystery, it's probably true that the government didn't believe it to be, as I said, a loyalist rather than a radical production, or they'd hardly have taken the risk of introducing it at Hardy's trial. These satires were, as I suggested earlier, a strikingly novel kind of propaganda. Mock playbills had been used before as political satire, but never before apparently had they been printed as if to be passed off in the street like real advertising bills. In early 1794, the novelty and the beguiling verisimilitude of the form, its potential for easy distribution, especially as a handbill rather than as a posting bill, and the apparently Republican content of these satires caused considerable alarm. Following the arrests of Hardy and others, the government established a committee of secrecy in each of the Houses of Parliament to report on the extent of the supposedly treasonable conspiracy in which the societies were engaged. In a paragraph in its second report, concentrating specifically on radical propaganda, the Commons Committee warned the nation that the reform societies had been carefully developing the means to familiarize the lower orders of society with every species of treason. An appearance of insignificance and levity, the committee acknowledged, characterized much of the society's propaganda. In particular, it says their playbills and songs. But this, it argued, was an additional proof of their art and industry, of their scheme of mixing propaganda in the shape most likely to captivate attention with the ordinary occupations and amusements of their intended readers. In the mass interrogations that followed the arrests, prisoner after prisoner was asked if they'd seen these bills, who had printed them, who had circulated them. We're dealing, remember, at this time only with these two, which are the only ones that have appeared. Nothing conclusive was discovered. At the trial of John Thelwall, Long Faces was produced as evidence against him, as La Guillotine was used against Hardy, in an attempt to show that their political opinions were such as to suggest that they might well have imagined the king's death and so were guilty of treason. Over a dozen of the radical leaders in London were charged with high treason. But after the first 3 trials had resulted by early December 1794 in triumphant acquittals, the government, to its enormous embarrassment, was forced to abandon the attempt to use the law of treason to suppress the radical movement. Throughout most of 1794, the government had been able to represent itself as having acted boldly to frustrate a treasonable plot against the Constitution. When the threadbare evidence was revealed in court, still more the threadbare legal arguments, it seemed to many that the government had attempted to spin what was no more than an outspoken campaign for reform into a revolutionary conspiracy. The trials began to be narrated as the triumph of honest English jurymen over a violent and oppressive government. Other circumstances helped increase the unpopularity of the government in late 1794 and early 1795. In 1794, the harvest was shriveled by an unusually hot, dry summer. The following winter was the 3rd coldest of the century, and the winter wheat failed. With taxation continually rising to pay for the war and food prices already high, these failures threatened a year of still higher food prices, serious shortages, even famine, for those unable to pay them, and so popular protest and violence. Second, in January 1795, the Allied armies fighting in Flanders were effectively defeated. Holland fell, or rather willingly surrendered itself to the French, who by the end of the month occupied also the whole of what is now Belgium, virtually all of Germany west of the Rhine, and much of southeastern France, which had belonged to the King of Sardinia, and much of northern Spain. In addition, the war effort of all Britain's allies was heavily subsidized by funds from Britain or by loans underwritten by Britain or the British stock market. Pitt personally and his government collectively had never before been so unpopular, and this unpopularity inspired and was exploited by caricaturists, newspapers, writers of propaganda for the parliamentary opposition led by Fox, and by more plebeian writers connected with the movement for reform. The floodgates opened, and a long series of mock advertisements began to be published. Most of them appeared first in radical newspapers, such as the Courier and the Telegraph, but were then reprinted and sold at a penny each as single sheets, in form exactly like genuine playbills and advertisements for other public entertainments, and with inventive typographical variation which brilliantly parodied the hyperbole of genuine advertisements. The first mock advertisement discovered in 1794 was small in format, smaller than an A4 sheet, and modeled on advertising handbills, as I've said, passed out in the street. As we've seen, however, La Guillotine, though it first appeared as a handbill, was later reprinted as a broadside, twice the size or more. The remaining mock advertisements were almost all printed as broadsides. Though we've no record of quite how they were used, they often turn up in collections that seem to have been assembled early. And it seems possible that they were deliberately collected in the same way as were political tokens, radical propaganda in the form of farthings, halfpennies, and pennies. I'll be showing you some of those later. And some of these handbills, I believe, were even published for collectors. If any of you are old like me and were around in 1968, you'll remember that for every 10 students on the streets in Paris, there was a bibliomane following them around trying to snap up all the ephemera they could find. And that's why there are such enormous collections in libraries of 1968 political ephemera from all sorts of countries. I mean, people realized in 1968 immediately that here was something that was going to come and go very quickly and was very collectible. Well, so they did in 1795. As we've seen, and there's other evidence of the same effect, some radical propaganda was put into circulation by bill stickers. And it's likely that, like the supposed early version of La Guillotine, these broadsides were clandestinely pasted up in the street alongside genuine advertisements, from which at a distance they would have been indistinguishable. This caricature of 1795 by a mysterious caricaturist who signed himself West, nobody knows who he is, shows a bill sticker pasting up a proclamation on a dead wall, a wall without doors or windows, where it takes its place above what's probably a radical version of the old song, "Oh Dear, What Can the Matter Be?" and alongside the great hit of 1795, Elizabeth Inchbald's "In the Dead of the Night," as sung in her play The Wedding Day by the great actress Dorothy Jordan. It seems as if during the day this spot is the pitch of a ballad seller. Also stuck to the wall, however, is an advertisement for a double bill at Covent Garden or Drury Lane, Goldsmith's The Good-Natured Man, and as the afterpiece, The Farce of the Alarmist. There was no such afterpiece with that title, and the playbill is evidently being imagined as a mock advertisement of the kind I'll be talking about in this paper. Wordsworth's account of street advertising in the London of the 1790s may also suggest that mock advertisements were pasted to walls as if they were genuine. He writes of ballads and advertisements of giant size pasted to dead walls, below which one, and I break now into verse, fronted with a most imposing word, is peradventure one in masquerade. The editors of the Norton Prelude suggest that unlike the other bills, this one is in masquerade because it disguised the true nature of the goods on sale, i.e. it was an advertisement. But it seems rather more likely to me that it was one of these mock advertisements Wordsworth had in mind. He was living in Lincoln's Inn in early 1795, in the months when almost all the bills I discussed were produced, and indeed just a few doors from one of the big sellers of these mock advertisements. To see or to imagine such spurious bills pasted up among the genuine would have reinforced the primary message of many of them, that the activities of the king and the government, state occasions like the opening of Parliament or whatever, were no more or less than spectacles or illusions designed at once to distract the public from the urgency of the political crisis and to dazzle them into political subjection. The same arguments that Paine is using are circulated now, the same arguments that, indeed, that Wollstonecraft makes against Burke's rhetoric is this, it's all about dazzling, it's all about keeping people enslaved to a sort of a sensual eye and preventing them from seeing the real. The first group of post-trial advertisements was directed primarily against Pitt. The huge and humorless authority with which he spoke in Parliament and his freedom from every private vice except bibulousness had made it difficult before the London treason trials for radical and opposition writers to find in him the kind of weakness that gives a handle for satire. The acquittals, however, provided two. Pitt was called by the defense to give evidence at the trial of Tooke, with the aim of establishing that Tooke was on trial for his life for doing no more than Pitt had once done in the cause of reform. On his examination, however, Pitt claimed to have forgotten the most material aspects of his career as a reformer, and his reluctant and shifty testimony had put in question, or so it could be pretended, the reliability of his memory. Throughout the 13 months following Tooke's acquittal, the amnesia which had so suddenly afflicted him became the most frequent topic in satires of Pitt, and so ensured that he would never be allowed to forget what he could not remember. Secondly, the acquittals allowed the alarmism that Pitt had carefully nurtured since the Royal Proclamation of 1792, but which had arguably now been declared by 3 juries to have no rational basis. It allowed that alarmism to be treated as an object of mirth as well as of anger. There had been no revolutionary plot. Pitt and his friends had been imagining things. Pitt's first appearance in the mock advertisements of late 1794 and early 1795 was as the illusionist Signor Guglielmo Pitacchio, whose personality, swaggering, boastful, defensive, was modeled on that of the genuine illusionist, so to speak, Giuseppe Pinetti. Pinetti had visited England with great professional success in the previous decade, and Pitt had first been compared with him in a satire which appeared in the late 1780s in the Rolliad. Pitacchio is the star of 3 successive advertisements, the first of which was widely reprinted and became very widely known. Thereafter, he starred in at least 2 more and made guest appearances in pasquinades, mainly directed at other politicians. I'll show you. I'm not overrun, but I have to linger on these a little. This is the first one in which Pitacchio appears, as I say, as the heaven-born conjurer. He was described as a heaven-born minister by a flattering sycophant in Parliament at some point. And he has a series of tricks, all of which are elaborate sort of reworkings of his political tactics or of the way he controls Parliament. For example, that's his memory. I'm looking for his. He'll make marvelous experiments on his memory by forgetting the most material incidents of his life with an almost incredible precision. In the course of the entertainments, the sublime Pitacchio will exhibit upwards of 200 automata or moving puppets who will rise up, sit down, say yes or no, receive money. This is his majority in Parliament, of course, and so on. The whole thing ends rather sadly. He says he had hoped to engage some tightrope dancers who are hardy, took and fell, all who were to be hanged following the treason trials, but he's been disappointed of them. They've been acquitted. So he will instead offer an exhibition of himself on the tightrope, dancing on the tightrope, i.e. this is all about the opening of Parliament. He'll hang himself for the entertainment of everybody. There's one version which says, yes, here we are. He's going to perform this play, The Humbug or John Bull, a Jackass, in which Signor Pitacchio, not having yet engaged any female performers, this is a joke about his apparent total lack of interest in sex, will indulge the company with a solo on the viol d'amour, i.e. will masturbate on the stage for the entertainment of the company. This one is still about, I mean, Pitt is delaying the opening of Parliament as much as he can because all the news is so bad and he doesn't want to face the opposition. And here's one where he rejects any suggestion that he's he's delaying performing Parliament. And anyway, he's got some wonderful tricks too. He will produce some extraordinary effects upon the money of his auditors and spectators, of which he will considerably lessen the value by the simple operation of his breath. And so it goes on. And this is very good. This comes straight out of Pinetti's advertisements, who had these wonderful boastful things like, you know, corresponding member of the academies of Bologna and so and so. This has this too, and lots of Pinetti stuff's in Latin when he describes his enormous qualifications. First Lord of the Treasury, Chancellor of the Exchequer, Proudartissimus, Vinum Guzzolando Potentissimus, Pretty Girlibus Indifferentissimus, and so on and so on. And once again, he's offering to hang himself at the end. So then after these, as I say, there are 3 Pinetti advertisements to begin with. This rather long one here, which is too long to go through in detail. But then, and he also begins to make, he appears in this one, which is an interesting one. It's an auction sale in which he, as it were, sells, you know, he sells all his attributes, such as they are, like his memory and so on. This is signed AL, which, as Harriet was saying at her lecture the other day, is a code for a lady, though it tends to be used by men more. But this is very probably by a lady. There was a woman who wrote a very interesting political pamphlet for the LCS and signed it AL. The LCS has a debate about it. It's very interesting. It's actually rather a moderate pamphlet. It says, you know, calm down, all of you. But the LCS has a debate about whether it's going to approve this pamphlet or not. And they're very worried because they find it very, very extreme and bloodthirsty, and it's entirely because it's by a woman. It's much less extreme than almost everything they publish, but there's something about women entering this field which alarms them. But anyway, this is probably by the same woman, and you can trace it through advertisement pages where it does appear to be by the same one as wrote the pamphlet the LCS might have. And so he starred in these three things and a few more, and he made guest appearances in pasquinades mainly directed at other politicians. He also gave birth to a number of imitators. In February 1795, the Morning Post reinvented him as Signor Pito, the hero of a serious English opera called The Campaign. In a broadside of 2 months later, Signor Pito became Mr. Pito. In another February broadside, he becomes, I don't quite know how to pronounce this, Pitpache. This is quite an amusing one as well. About we, old Nick and the King, as aforesaid, think it highly expedient that some pretense should be invented by which we can make them, i.e. constitutional reformers, slaves without injuring their feelings as free men, and signing them up to the army is one of those. But this is, as it were, this is the first one we've seen which isn't advertising a performance. This is well, there was the auction sale. This is a mock proclamation. Despot, in inverted commas, who, and these are very interesting. They're very, very funny. He's confronted on the outcome of the trials and the failures of war by his adoring subject Mustafa in tones of abject humility and in a form and language derived, much of it from the Song of Songs. But they're very interesting. I mean, they're interesting because though they're broadside sized, advertisement sized, they don't look like they're for pasting up in the street. I mean, they don't have that kind of typography. And I think they're probably really produced with the collector in mind. I mean, they'd appeared in the newspapers shortly, but if people wanted a permanent record of them, they could buy them. But they're clearly not destined for the street, I think. They're very interesting, too, in that they're really rather moving. Mustafa's desperate attempts to animate the cold and melancholy Pitt you end up making Pitt rather a tragic figure. I mean, Mustafa offers his own body and that of numerous houris, and nothing moves Pitt to any kind of reaction or warmth. And there's something, tragic about poor Mustafa, but still more tragic about this perfectly sealed body that Pitt preserves. Here's one. Harlech is a terrible slide, I'm afraid. I think I may have a better one later. This one is when they start looking at other targets apart from Pitt. This is to do with the trial for corruption of the Governor General of Bengal, Warren Hastings, which was about to collapse when this came out. Harlequin impeacher is aimed principally, though rather casually, at Edmund Burke. It sort of does the whole radical plot about Burke, how Burke caused the terror and everything else in the description of the scenes and the acts run you through the whole process by which things as they are have developed out of things as they were in Burke's reflections. when Burke's not being attacked, another favorite target is Henry Dundas, formerly the Home Secretary, now the Secretary of War, who, as Home Secretary, had coordinated the attack on the radical societies, and in 1795 was seen as equally responsible with Pitt for the disasters of the Flanders campaign. As the scale of the Allied defeat in the 1994-5 campaign became more apparent, and as the Allies asked for more and more financial support from Britain, and the alliance itself threatened to break down, the mock-advertisements increasingly focused on the conduct of the war by Pitt and Dundas, by the King's second son, the Duke of York, by William Wyndham, the junior war minister, and by the greedy and untrustworthy allies, or so they were presented. This one relates to the fast days, the days of national humiliation in which you confess your sins to God and pray that in return God will smite your enemies. But the point of these fast day satires is always that the rich may be, the poor may be fasting, they have little choice, but the rich probably aren't. So Dundasio, Henry Dundas, celebrates the fast day with a grand eating match, which includes a bottle oration by the sublime Pitacchio and so on, and a general kind of total gross out. The Long Faces one we looked at the beginning, that was for the, produced for the fast day of 1794. This is the fast day of 1795. So here's a new form of exhibition. Now, who were the publishers and retailers of these broadsides? And why, after the mock advertisements of early 1794 had caused such alarm, were those of late 94 and early 95 allowed to be sold without apparent threat of prosecution? But let me talk first of all about the publishers. Of all the satirical broadsides published in late 1794 and 1795, about 35 have survived. Most were published by men who started up as booksellers, perhaps along with some other trade, late in 1794 or early in 1795. Or who, if they'd sold books before, had done so in a very small way of business. The most prolific in this line was George Ribot. Here he's advertising an art exhibition. If you can read the small print, you'll see that it consists of a series of paintings by politicians which are reviewed as Royal Academy paintings would be reviewed, with brief descriptions, brief lines about them, but they're all very pertinent to what's going on, of course. Now, George Ribot, who had a shop in the Strand, published at least 12 satirical broadsides early in 1795. He'd set up as an occasional bookseller 7 years earlier, but he's known to have produced no more than 10 titles between 1788 and 1794. When he began to publish the writings of the best-selling millenarian prophet, Richard Brothers. In 1795, suddenly, he was able to produce at least 57 titles. Then, with Brothers in a lunatic asylum and his followers mainly disillusioned, Ribot may have published only 16 more titles in the 5 years from 1796 to 1800. So there's Ribot, who's really distinctly a plebeian bookseller, though he's in the fashionable shopping street in the Strand. He has a tiny little premises there in the least fashionable end. Another broadside, this is one about, this is one of those broadsides or handbills that gets passed out when a malefactor is being executed in public at Tyburn. And this imagines Pitt so being executed, and it tells you his life story, basically on a very local scale. You know, he's the bully of a local village. And the whole thing is told of him as being that kind of a bully. Now, this is published by John Berks, who set up as a bookseller late in 1794, after being dismissed from his post as a clerk in the East India House for being a member of the LCS. and who seems to have published nothing at all after 1795. So he's just an opportunist bookseller, guy who's bought a few founts of type. You can see this isn't very elaborately typographical, and who just, you know, publishes a few things to tide him over till he gets another job, perhaps, or whatever. Pitpatch's Requisition, which we've already glanced at, was produced by the shoemaker and LCS member John Bullock, and it seems to have been the only thing he ever published in his life. I mean, he just borrowed some types, I assume. 14 of the broadsides are unattributed, but many of these are listed for sale in the advertisement leaves of newly emergent radical plebeian booksellers, and no doubt most originated among such men. The most inventive and courageous of these booksellers was Citizen Richard Lee, who was responsible for at least 10 and perhaps more of these broadsides, and who'd published nothing at all before 1795 himself, though he had published some poems, Methodist poems, with another bookseller. So Richard, or as he came to rename himself, Citizen Lee, was a poet, Republican, and millenarian who was twice expelled from the LCS for opposing the increasingly atheist tendency of the society. He refused to sell in his shop Paine's Age of Reason or Volney's Ruins, and he was expelled from the society for that. He announced himself as a publisher of these mock advertisements in February by the satire, 1795, by the satire Royal Vagabonds. This is on the occasion of the fall of Holland, and it celebrates the Harlequin Stadtholder coming to Britain with his basket of oranges, the Orange family, of course. And it imagines the whole flight of kings from all over Europe coming to Britain. One of the things I don't have time to do is show how these handbills relate to what's on at the theatre in London at the time. I mean, you need to read them with the newspapers very carefully and see how particular advertisements are being sort of parodied as they produce these imaginary plays. And Lee also took the enormous risk of reprinting Long Faces under the title Amusement for Starving Mechanics. This, you remember, is a fast day bill. The mechanics are starving anyway, and here's what their amusement, the comical tragedy of the Long Faces, in which Nebuchadnezzar, who throughout 1795 is being, George III throughout 1795 is being satirized as Nebuchadnezzar, the king who went mad and nearly lost his throne, and so on. And then the whole thing becomes much more serious, much more textual, and is basically a radical dissenting attack on the war. It is, however, a more seditious version than the first version. And the fact that Lee escaped prosecution for republishing Long Faces when half a dozen people around the country had been imprisoned for publishing a less seditious version a year earlier, it must have provided an important indication to radical booksellers that they were likely to enjoy more freedom to publish in 1795 than they had the previous year. Lee followed this up by reprinting this third Pitacchio satire we glanced at earlier from the newspapers, and then he begins to develop a very distinctive typographical style. I mean, this is a mess compared with his best work. It starts in two handbill-sized satires. This is a good one. This is to do with the hair powder tax that Pitt introduced in his budget of 1795. The idea was there being an enormous shortage of wheat and hair powder being made out of wheat flour. One way it would be a really progressive tax, to tax everybody who wore hair powder a guinea a year. So some people would leave off and there'd be more wheat to make into bread. And if they didn't, well, that would be another guinea to use to subsidize the armies of Austria or wherever. This is Lee's version of it, a license for the guinea pigs to wear hair powder, and so it goes on. And he's saying there's been a completely feloniously counterfeited license, which is the official government license in circulation. Don't buy that. That's a fake. This is the true one. And of course, he's concerned to make the point, as everybody did about the hair powder text, that if Pitt had known more about the world he lived in, he would have known that this was a tax that fell very heavily on the poor, because numerous servants had to powder their hair. There was a vast class of people on very low wages who had to powder their hair, and this was, as it were, another guinea out of a salary of something like £26 a year that they were earning, that they had to fork out in order to look respectable. Basically, the typographical style involves blocks of prose with there's only one here, large cross headings in various fonts. The best example, King Killing, we'll look at in a little while, but the most amusing of the broadsides he produced are a pair from late spring or early summer, which contrast the two possible futures. On the one hand, the defeat of France and the restoration of the monarchy, here, and on the right, an entire change of performances querying the opposite imagined future, where the revolution comes home to Britain in a wonderful carnivalesque celebration, ending with female citizens dancing in patterns, all in Parliament Street. You know, I mean, female citizens entering the West End and in this pig-like carnivalesque thing. I sometimes think this was written by a graduate student who's just read White and Stalybras, but the whole thing is so routinely carnivalesque in a way, but it's still very, very funny. And as you can see, the typefaces are extraordinary and working very beautifully. I like this one enormously when this is to do with the restoration of the monarchy, and little, I suppose, 9 or 11-year-old he might be by now, Louis XVII, the Dauphin, as he'd being restored to his throne. Mr. Pitt, seated majestically in a superb suit of changeable silk, the young monarch on his knee. And the contrast between the huge typeface monarch and this tiny boy, brought home by the notion of him entering Paris triumphantly, dandled on Pitt's knee, is really rather good, I think. There are various possible answers. God, I'm overrunning, I'm afraid. Do you mind? It's because I promised myself not to talk about the individual ones, then I've started to, and I've got no page numbers on this thing. So. Anyway, there are various possible answers to the question why the publishers of these broadsides, and why Lee in particular, weren't prosecuted in the early months of '95. By no means all of the broadsides would have been regarded by the law officers of the Crown as seditious libels, at least not as sufficiently obviously so as to make it likely that their publishers could be successfully prosecuted. Prosecutions for seditious libel or seditious words were usually in the mid-1790s directed against insults to the king, and though the advertisements produced before the 1794 trials were evidently directed against George, most of those which appeared in 1795 are primarily aimed at Pitt and his ministers. At least 2 of Lee's advertisements, however, his reissue of Long Faces and an entire change of performances, this one, together with his hair powder license, quite clearly fall within the category of seditious texts. Texts whose tendency was to bring the king into dislike or disrespect in the official definition. And yet there's no sign that when they appeared, the law officers contemplated taking action against Lee, as they had against the publishers of Long Faces the previous year. And in fact, throughout the 12 months from the acquittal of Hardy to November 1795, they brought no charges of seditious libel in London against the radical booksellers, who in those months were routinely publishing works which were much more seditious than those which in '93 and early '94 had been routinely prosecuted. This inaction, indeed, on the part of the law officers must be regarded as one reason for the considerable increase in the number of plebeian radical booksellers in the capital in 95. Attempting to justify his inaction to Parliament in November 95, the Attorney General, Sir John Scott, declared that there were simply now too many libels published for it to be possible to prosecute them. This was an odd explanation, for prosecutions for political writings were intended to be exemplary, to have a deterrent effect. The way to stop an epidemic of libels was to prosecute one or two. There are two more probable explanations of the law officer's action, or the lack of it. As we've seen, the mock-advertisements began to proliferate immediately after the acquittals in the treason trials, and it seems plain that radical publishers believed in the radical euphoria that followed the trials, that the government now despaired of securing convictions against radicals in the London courts. They had, as one pamphleteer put it, suffered a knockdown blow with the collapse of the prosecutions, and now believed that any prosecution of the radical movement would be regarded by London juries as oppressive and would be thrown out. There's probably some truth in that, but it may also be true that the government was biding its time, waiting for a favourable occasion to introduce more severe penalties against the publication of libels, in the belief subsequently justified that this would be a more effective deterrent than prosecution, which always risked appearing oppressive to all but the most convinced loyalists. The occasion came when, at the end of October, the King's coach was mobbed and a stone thrown at him as he was driving to the state opening of Parliament. The government responded by immediately introducing the Treasonable Practices Bill, which I told you about, which had been, however, in preparation a good deal earlier, and which increased the, as I said, gave a second conviction for seditious libel was made punishable by transportation for 7 years. 2 weeks after the introduction of this bill, Richard Lee was arrested and charged with seditious libel. It was not for any of his mock advertisements that Lee was to be prosecuted, but principally for the handbill provocatively entitled King Killing, which advocated regicide as a public benefit and which, according to the government, had been circulated at a mass meeting of the LCS a few days before the alleged assassination attempt on the king that took place in late October when the stone was thrown. Indeed, they claimed that this handbill had directly inspired that attempt. Lee himself explained that the text of the handbill was transcribed directly from an article by a young Catholic radical, John Pitchford, published earlier in the year in Norwich, which hadn't been prosecuted. The only substantive change Lee made, so he claimed, was to change the title from tyrannicide to king killing to ensure that prospective purchasers would know just what they would be buying. What Lee didn't say was that the article, as it originally appeared, in that article, this was a speech by an advocate of regicide who was properly answered and told that in all circumstances king killing was a mistake. Tyrannicide was a mistake because though kings almost all deserved killing, the chaos that might follow the assassination or judicial execution of a king would be too dangerous. Before he could be brought to trial, Lee escaped from custody disguised as a woman, and in company with the wife of a government spy with whom he'd been having an affair, made his way to the safety of Philadelphia. Most of these advertisements remained on sale at least until the autumn of 1795, months after the immediately topical events they referred to had ceased to be news. A part of their remarkable contemporary popularity may have been the manner in which they mobilized a figure frequently used in propaganda, satire, polemics against Pitt's ministry. And I think I'm going to cut something here, if you'll give me 2 seconds to work out what to cut. What I'm basically cutting is an argument that you find in a number of writers at the time, serious political commentators, which is always comparing Pitt's dealings with France and with reformers at home as a plot, but as the plot of a play. And everything gets referred satirically to this notion of Pitt's great plot, which is imagined as a play. So when, before the trials, the treason trials take place in London, there are some in Scotland, in Edinburgh, and people say, oh, well, they're just trying it out in a provincial theatre before seeing if they can bring it to London with success, you know. And everything is talked about in those terms. And there's a brilliant pamphleteer called Francis Plowden, who, a radical Catholic, there were several around at the time, who published a history of 1794, the first attempt to give a history of that year, in which he works on this almost exhaustively. He talks about, you know, and he reviews the trials as if they were theatrical performances. You know, he says, you know, about how the connection of the plot, the shifting of the scenes, and the wonderful deception of the machinery were only too apparent, he says. And so he goes on. And it's to this figure, as it appears in Plowden's history and in others similar, if less elaborate and less sophisticated works, that the various bills refer, which announce dramatic representations of the treason trials, of Dundacia's own grand exhibition of the war against France, and of a series of other moments in Pitt's great plot. This is to do with the Quiberon campaign, the attempt to link up with loyalists in Western France, which was in mid-1795, which was such a disaster. This assures the public that whatever defects they may perceive in the contrivance and management of the plot, they shall have no reason to complain of expense being spared or of the want of tragic effect in the catastrophe. The chief originality of the playbills, however, what made them at once so novel and so popular, doesn't lie in this figure, I think, nor in the general idea of making political satire out of advertisements, even of showmen's advertisements. That idea is as old as Swift. It's that by focusing not on the theatre itself, but on theatre advertising, they'd found a new way of representing the familiar notion of politics as theatre, of political plots as the plots of drama, in a way which made that notion especially accessible to a popular audience. The originality is in printing the mock advertisement in a form which releases it from the context of the satirical pamphlet and allows it to be stuck up or imagined as stuck up in the tavern or the street. Indeed, the mock advertisements and other satirical broadsides may have been, for the short time they were popular, the most successful solution to an enduring problem for radical propagandists in the 1790s, how to create a radical visual culture which could associate ideology with memorable visual imagery and could address, among others, those who, though not illiterate, were not habitual readers. Caricatures were expensive to produce, and there was no likelihood of developing a radical public, large or affluent enough, to support a radical alternative to the generally pro-government work of hired guns like Gilray and Rowlandson and Cruikshank. Gilray, it's true, repeatedly satirized Pitt throughout 1795, but not from the standpoint of the reform movement or the Foxite opposition. In the last 2 months of 1795, many of the caricaturists were attacking the two bills, the two gagging bills that the government brought in. But once those bills had passed, they returned to supporting the government. Otherwise, there are very few resources for a radical visual culture. The most successful were probably the cheap medals produced to celebrate the acquittals in 1794, and this token coinage as produced by Thomas Spence, which was collected, as I said, but which, granted the chronic shortage of specie, may also have been circulated like real money It may thus have infiltrated itself into the pockets and purses of loyalists as well as radicals and been a frequent source of annoyance. A kind of everyday moment, radical moment, as it so, when you fumbled through your change and found that you've got some of Spence's tokens in there. How many have I shown you? Some more. This is Thelwall on his acquittal, a halfpenny. This is one of his ways. He takes old, worn-out coins and stamps them with messages and puts them into circulation. Land and parochial partnership. I've got a tiny little one, an old shilling, on which he stamped Spence's plan, the land is ours, you fools. And it's, presumably circulated as a shilling because the stamped letters are worn as well as the coin itself. Or radicals could put themselves on display, could try and create a visual culture of the body or of clothing, dressing and dressing their hair according to the Jacobin code. William Blake walking through Lambeth in his red nightcap, or Joseph Gerald at his trial in Edinburgh with his long hair loose and unpowdered. Thelwall, the radical skinhead, with a short Jacobin crop. But a visual culture which, like caricature, could convey partly by visual means of persuasive narrative or argument, was created in the 1790s only by the broadsides we're examining with their typographical variety and playfulness. One reason for the evident popularity of these mock advertisements must have been the fact that the theatrical culture to which most of them referred, or rather that the language of theatrical advertising they employed, was one which could function as something like a common language of satire, engaging the interest and knowledge of the polite, the vulgar, and a broad range of cultural identities between politeness and vulgarity. Interest in the theatre was widespread, and information about the theatre was ubiquitous and inescapable. The common repertory of the theatre and the most recent productions on the London stage were frequently appealed to by caricaturists to provide their satires with a recognizable narrative situation. A remarkable number of column inches of newspapers were given over to reviews of plays, to news about plays in production, the private lives of the leading actors, who with the royal family and the leading politicians enjoyed a prominence not very different from that of modern celebrities. I mean, this is a period that sees the beginning of a kind of celebrity culture, and it's primarily through the theatre, really. Interest in the London theatre spread far beyond London itself, not simply because London newspapers were increasingly becoming national newspapers, but because news about the London theatre was frequently reprinted from London newspapers in provincial newspapers, even though they might never see the plays. But also, of course, because the London stars did huge tours in the summer, so that you could see Sarah Siddons in York, in Newcastle, in Darlington. You stayed put and you would see the great actors every year. But the humor of these mock advertisements and the attempt they make to represent politics as theatre, as spectacle, as illusion, all that doesn't depend, I think, on appealing to those who actually and frequently attended the theatre. For though cheap versions of many of the tricks of showmen like Pinetti could be seen by the most vulgar at Bartholomew Fair, for example, these broadsides are modelled on advertisements for entertainments that few radical artisans or labourers could afford to attend. Entrance to Pinetti's show cost 2 shillings and 6pence. 10 times as much as to see La Guillotine, with the threepenny one, or whatever it was. This at a time when high admission charges for public amusements were justified as guaranteeing the exclusion of the vulgar. You can, if you price something high enough, you know that you're not going to be affronted by who sits next to you. In, as a director of Covent Garden Opera House put it last year, or a couple of years ago, in their smelly trainers. The high prices at Covent Garden Opera House are still justified on the grounds that it keeps out people in smelly trainers. Interesting. That's what it's like living in a monarchy. The mock advertisements mobilize a language which with which any reader of newspapers, anyone indeed walking the streets of London, would have been thoroughly familiar. Advertisements for plays, pantomimes, and other shows, often in the form of small playbills, but with less typographical pizzazz, were printed on the front page of most newspapers, often in the most prominent, the left-hand column. Playbills were stuck up on every wall in London and in every major town in the country. By its sheer ubiquitous, the language of theatre advertising could function as a language that addressed both the polite and the vulgar, much more effective than the languages of formal political debate, which differed widely according to the class identity of the author and the supposed audience. Partly because the theatrical culture they appealed to was so widely diffused, these mock advertisements confused the tidy division we often make in studying radical political culture in the revolutionary period between polite and popular culture. And believe me, almost every work on radical satire or on popular culture in the revolutionary period in Britain identifies as by radical plebeian authors works which a bit more research would have shown were written by really rather polite authors. These mock advertisements were invariably printed by booksellers who aimed at a popular radical market with little disposable income or formal education. Even among popular booksellers, there was a clear social hierarchy, divisions of class and status marked by the length and cost of their publications, the size of their premises, the way those premises were used. Daniel Isaac Eaton, for example, a famous plebeian publisher, is really very, very upmarket compared with Richard Lee or George Rebo. And it's those, the most plebeian of the lowest of the low, the most plebeian of the plebeian, who are publishing this stuff. But it's not at all clear how many of these handbills were written by members of that social class. We know that the first Pitacchio slide, this one, was produced by the polite, Harrow-educated poet Robert Merry. It's probable that the second in the Pitacchio series, this one, was produced by the Foxite MP Joseph Jekyll, a lawyer from a distinguished legal family, MP for Calne in the interest of the Marquis of Lansdowne, man with the reputation of being a great wag. Jekyll and Merry were both friends and political associates of Sheridan. Jekyll was a member of the same opposition grouping in the House of Commons, and Merry was a member of the polite and moderate Reform Club, the Friends of the People, to which Sheridan also belonged. And it seems quite likely that at least two more of these satires originated in Sheridan's circle. One mock advertisement for the pantomime Royal Vagabonds advertises an afterpiece called The Wonders of Gallia, which is clearly recalling the elaborate show by Philippe de Lauterberg, The Wonders of Derbyshire, which had been staged under the management of Sheridan at Drury Lane in 1779. The satire on Dandasio includes the announcement of a play to be performed by the King's Friends, called The King's Friends or The Dupe, whose title recalls the comedy The Dupe, written by Sheridan's mother, Frances, which had been repeatedly hissed during its brief run in the same theatre in 1763. Now, by early 1795, neither of these references would have meant much outside the circle of Sheridan, within which, however, they'd still have meant a good deal. La Guillotine was attributed, as I've said, within the LCS to a gentleman who, on the base, who kept his own phaeton and lived in Walworth and was also a French spy. On the basis of internal evidence, the author of Another Campaign, The New Tragedy, and of the series of mock exhibition reviews I stuck up briefly, seems to indicate that they too were by polite authors. Perhaps indeed only Long Faces in its two versions, here's the amusement, and an entire change of performances with the fractured French of its final phrase. We have actually something like 3 languages here, I take it, but intended to be French. a touch of Latin and a touch of English thrown in confusion. Those are the only ones that seem to be securely likely to have been written by, by vulgar authors or by plebeian authors. The evident popularity of these advertisements among radicals who Merry, Jekyll, and Sheridan would no doubt have themselves regarded as vulgar suggests that they invite into the theatre of politics those excluded from both theatre and politics, and by offering them the chance to discover that the Ancien Régime is an art of deception, to undeceive them. In many cases, however, the fine print of the invitation should be read with some suspicion, and this is very important in terms of the provenance, the authorship of these things. A common language, like that of theatrical advertising, is no guarantee of a common purpose. At first glance, for example, and supposing it for the moment to be a genuine example of radical propaganda, La Guillotine appears to be the most seditious of all these advertisements, offering the swinish multitude a front seat at the extinction of the hereditary monarchy, at a revolution which is imagined, however, not as their revolution, but that of a small Whig elite, Fox, Sheridan, Erskine Gray, whose political objectives were certainly not Republican and fell far short of universal suffrage or even the universal manhood suffrage demanded by the radical societies. Something similar is true of the pantomime Harlequin Impeacher, in which the heroes of the grand finale, the storming of the cabinet, are Earl Stanhope, the radical peer, another selection of aristocratic Whigs, and Horne Tooke and Thomas Holcroft, members of the polite and middle-class Society for Constitutional Information. The serio-comico-dramatico medley, advertised wherever it is, here we are, in Petacchio's third announcement, has a huge cast of wicked loyalists and virtuous patriots, only two of whom, Hardy and Thelwall, could pretend to represent the vulgar. Most of these advertisements, I'm saying, and I really am about to finish, invite the vulgar to participate in the performance of politics, to make a scene, to boo the government. By the figure of the vulgar as theatrical audience, they are imagined as an active popular or even public opinion which will hiss Pitt from office, but in the expectation that they will then cheer Fox to the stage, will applaud, huzzah, be enthralled by the sublime and animating spectacle of power passing into the hands of another set of hereditary aristocrats and polite career politicians. These men they are asked to accept are their leaders, and the actions of these men they're invited to believe will be, to quote Harlequin Impeacher, pro bono publico. The theatre of the world, they're told, is the theatre of the British Parliament. The revolution is to be delivered by a handful of Whigs whose admirable record of opposition to the war and to Pitt's attack on civil rights will persuade their audience to overlook the fact that they offer only the most moderate political reform. It may indeed be that one of the reasons for the popularity of these texts is that they spoke to a residual deference in the popular radical movement, the sense so hard to shake off that men of title and distinction really were their natural leaders, however suspicious members of that movement had learned to become about the pretensions to rule of the ruling class. This residual and reluctant deference is one of the things, I think, that distinguishes the radical movement in the 1790s from the Chartists of 40 or 50 years later. In this context especially, the mock playbills make sense of the question mark in the title, An Entire Change of Performances. This is the only advertisement which represents the swinish multitude as the actors as well as the audience in the imagined revolution, as heroes in their own play. We can read that query in the title as pointing to a continuing dilemma in the popular radical movement about how far it could use an aristocratic parliamentary opposition, which it admired but didn't trust, and which in turn sought to use it but didn't trust it, but didn't trust it, but didn't trust it. but didn't trust it, 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 but didn't trust